God, you're also smiley and adorable. What's up? Hold on.
Because we're so happy to see you. That's why.
Aw, here we all are in the ether together.
No, you have, of all the composers we've interviewed, you have by far the best background.
And it's not even one of those fake digital ones. It's just
amazing.
actually the slope of our ceiling. I live in a tree house, it turns out.
Awesome. How's class?
I mean, it's good. I'm just 2 days in, you know, it's a crazy, crazy moment to be teaching. And it's a moment that's full of new pressures and new opportunities. I mean, to be honest, I've actually had fun. Like I was worried about the chemistry in Zoom and trying to figure out energy and really, you know, it's starting from scratch. It's not like everybody knew each other and then transitioned to online, which is sort of what happened for the spring term folks. So yeah, I don't know. It's a grand experiment. Here we are in a minute.
How's curriculum writing, considering everything going on? Like what's changed? What's new for you?
Yeah, I mean, everything has changed. I feel like, I hope. So I'm teaching 2 classes right now. One is a class called Sound Art Practice, which is sort of upper level. We have a track through the music major at Dartmouth, which is called Sonic Arts. And so that happened right before they hired me, actually. And the idea was to offer a pathway through the music major, which was the sort of inverse of the maybe conservatory model of having to march through 3.5 years of Western tonal theory before you got to anything happening in the living moment. So yeah, it both centers the now, but it also, like, we teach software and strategies that allow people to start composing right away without needing Western notation as a background. And so it has a few different kind of ambitions, I would say, as a curricular project. But I'm teaching the intro class to that, and then an upper level class in that, which is sound art practice. And the intro level class is more, their creative work is like making little pieces in Audacity and Ableton. But the sound art project classes, I mean, it's going to be a bit more conceptual this time. They're going to be pitching projects more than a lot of hands-on experimentation. That's usually how I teach it anyways. But so, yeah, that's really thinking about sound as a conceptual source, as a social force, as a physical source, and as a sculptural force, and all of these sort of different, anything kind of outside the boundary of the score or the concert or the album, outside of that frame. So those are the launch points. In terms of what I've tried to do, I mean, it's, you know, in many ways stuff I've tried to do already. I just did it with a lot more fire under my ass. And that was really to just like break any compulsion I might have previously felt to think chronologically or to teach chronologically or to share a canon I had inherited or to tell a story that was told to me, because that is a very, very specific story. And even when you start like with 1913 or something, if you still tell it chronologically, it centers that white patrilineal line of sonic experimentation, even if you sort of land in a place that has more openness in terms of how that narrative is being created, because it's the story we're telling right now. So one of the things I'm just not doing is not telling that story at all. I'm centering all living artists. It's not that precedents in history won't come up, but they're sort of hopefully only going to come up in service of us understanding with more depth the creative choices of a given artist, whoever we happen to be looking at that week. So that's how the sound art class is going. Yeah, and I mean, the intro to sound arts class is always a bit wild, but like on day one, or like day one was just an intro, but so we had our first class yesterday, which was like really in the content and the meat of the course. And instead of just, you know, teaching the futurists, which is sort of where that story often starts, we looked at the futurists and the art of noises, but then we looked at this album that came out 6 days ago called by DeForest Brown Jr. I don't know if you guys know this artist, but it's called Black Sonic Nationalist Weaponry. I think I have the title right. Black National Sonic Weaponry. No, I think it's Sonic Nationalist Weaponry. Anyway, it's a super radical, super provocative, like I said, 6-day-old album. And so we were trying to wrestle with this idea of like the noise of the now and how each of these sets of artists, in their words, because the DeForest Brown Jr., he goes by Speaker Music too, but came with like also a sort of zine that you downloaded with it, which is filled with all of these essays on, again, with like very vibrant living voices on Black sonic radicalism. And so really, and both of those, like the Futurist and so DeForest Brown also helps curate this I guess collective, you might call it, called techno black again. So it's really an excavation also, but both of these forces, the futurist and speaker music, take perspective, and Detroit techno kind of as a starting point on technology and our relationship with like either techno utopias or techno dystopias. And so there was a lot of launch points there, or linkages between them. But just to share, I don't know if that was day 2 experiment. I'll let you know about day 10 when I get there.
Well, so that puts 2 thoughts in my head. One is just out of curiosity how you're structuring if you're not doing chronologically, and if there are any parallels or people that you found pair that we sort of see in different canons or we view as separate entities that you find links other than chronological links.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. That's I think the one I've tried so far. And again, I was trying to make those links. So speaker music is very much operating in, I mean, he's the curator and a writer, but I guess maybe you'd call it on the sort of experimental side of electronic music. So this album in particular it's very pulse driven, and it sort of deals with an aesthetic drum rack palette that comes from techno for sure. But there's no consistent pattern. It's like this constant frenetic rhythmic attack layered, and yes, there's samples of course, but there's tons of different kinds of samples, some of which come from like Police, whatever you call it. They're not actually walkie-talkies, they sound like walkie-talkies. You know what I mean? Like samples of sort of Police communicate with each other through that crackly, that really identifiable crackle. Yeah, and so there I was looking for linkages across perspectives on technology, on these like claims to just like be desperately seeking a sonic surface and depth that was like dealing with the moment. You know, the futurists weren't just, they wanted to burn everything down, but it was because like the world was changing around them and instruments couldn't possibly speak to that anymore, like Western instruments or museums or libraries or all the various things they wanted to really quite literally burn down. And I think DeForest Brown too is just like, it's so deep and saturated with an effort to speak to intervene in, to like collaborate out of this exact moment. But yeah, I mean, I think for me, some of those links happen also, like, there isn't that much for me in this class of a distinction between like Halim El-Dab doing the first kind of repurposing technology in Cairo in 44 to make the first tape piece, or Daphne Oram like making some crazy ass like custom synthesizer with, I mean, insane amounts of intricacy and kind of singular vision, and like Grandmaster Flash like totally figuring out how to deal with the turntable as not just a thing to reproduce sound, and even not just as a thing that can like isolate a breakbeat and then switch it to another one, but also like as a thing that if it's scratched with polyrhythmic precision, it's an instrument. It becomes this instrument that adds this whole other musical surface. And so all 3 of those examples, like they took a pre-existing, I mean, Daphne Oram actually created the technology, so that's maybe a bit of a difference, but they weren't necessarily all inventors, but they took an existing technology and reconceived of its function to produce innovation and to like really shift auditory culture making in some capacity. So I don't know, those are maybe some of the ways I'm trying to make linkages that are both across what are traditionally defined as like genre markers, but also across chronologies and things like that.
Sure, and it reminds me of one of your tenets, I guess, in your music, this idea of aesthetic as politics. I wanted to talk a little bit more about that for you. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, I don't know, I'd be really excited to hear how y'all are being taught these days. Me not being in school anymore, I will speak of like the moralisms I was raised with many, many, many years ago. But I, in my education, like was really raised in this very Eurocentric, like white supremacist landscape where there was a presumption that abstraction, there was a sort of space of musical abstraction that could avoid the mediation or the sort of dirtiness of anything social, let's say, or anything that we might associate with a named identity these days. I would say sort of at each moment in my evolution, I have like confronted that frustration with, I would hope to say, I mean, I don't want to suggest a kind of linear progress, but an expanding kind of front of confronting that. I think really early on when I was like a little, feisty 18-year-old at Oberlin, I think, my interest actually in noise and in like chaotic sonic phenomena had a lot to do with a sort of politics. It wasn't about this sort of claim to an ideal space. I felt like the types of hypercomplexity that were being revealed, the types of systematic compositional structuring that we were being taught. I mean, I hated them for all sorts of reasons. Like on a very affective level, they bored the hell out of me. But like on a worldview level, this sort of notion of like little notes that just behaved like you touch a D sharp and it does exactly what you think it's going to do, exactly when you think it's going to do it. And like the whole thing is you just like ordering these worldviews and these segmented little discrete objects. Like that's a colonial mindset. It comes out of notation comes out of a moment when the world was being like flux in all of its sort of forms was being just like chopped up and segmented. And that could be the flux of like nature, like if we're thinking about sort of landscape and that kind of like literally the way gardens started to be produced, but also as we're segmenting human beings into chattel slavery and into actual humans with subjects that have like historical force. I mean, that kind of separation is happening there. It's all like really around that early, that kind of late 1500s birth of colonial capitalism, that it's just all entangled. And I wouldn't have talked about it exactly that way back then, but I was feeling this like sense of domination and flatness and the kind of servitude of notes, which is how I got to noise and how I got to a lot of that other stuff. But of course, that wasn't enough, right? That sort of horizon of pushing against that moralism, I think I hope will be an ever evolving part of myself and my psyche and my practice, and will never, ever, ever be done. But I think I say it there to sort of name that, or as a kind of core part of the way that I think about art making and kind of co-presence and what it means for us to get together around sound or around phenomena at all.
And your point about the colonialism of notation interests me, particularly because you have works that in their architecture defy any ability to be notated with a standard practice. It takes a really visually creative mind to represent something like Force of Things, right? Where it's such an architectural work that how do you put it on paper and say, yeah, read left to right? Like it's just like everything else. I'm curious how, I mean, each piece has to be different in some regard, that openness with which you approach so many different mediums.
Yeah, and I would say that my relationship to notation actually is one of these like progressively expanding parts of my practice, but also maybe this sort of place that each time I'm trying to shed more and more of the baggage that comes with notation, which again, it's colonial history, but then it also establishes, yeah, I mean, whatever, we all know the drill. Like Western notation is really good at writing down certain parts of sound. It's not the part that interests me most. So then one way around that is to make like elaborate graphic notation that sort of gets again towards physical movement and not towards specifying, the exact sonic output or whatever. So I kind of did that for a minute, but then that also that wasn't enough. And I think in a lot of ways, my early time in the electronic music studio in my early 20s was really pivotal, because I just like got to let go of performers altogether. Because in my earlier undergrad, I couldn't get players to do what I wanted them to do. I got more and more angry about it, to the point that I was like about to leave grad school. Actually, I almost dropped out after my first year. And I had a real break. I mean, it's a kind of a common story, I think, for composers throughout the 20th century at least, but to have a kind of revelatory first experience in the studio. But I think a lot of that for me, like it was a little bit of a room of my own, in a sense of both getting to avoid notation, so like not having to make it semantic, but also just like avoiding the kind of social noise and the power dynamics that are inevitably at play when you try to get players to do what you want, and the kind of anxiety sphere that was as a young composer, where like, you're not doing it. I can't tell if I'm fucking up or if you're fucking up. I just know this isn't what I want it to be. And like, I hate everything about this. And I'm just gonna, so just like cutting that out also, then it was just like me, objects, microphones, my ears, just endless hours. And I think my growth towards sort of my specific sound world really accelerated in that environment. So that's a space where like notation doesn't exist at all. But yeah, it's just gotten progressively far away from the written score, actually. So in Force of Things, I was dealing at its start, although in current stagings less and less so, but at its start it was like I was working with ICE on the project. So I was working with trained amazing musicians, Western trained amazing musicians. So we could communicate in a certain way, in time, but we actually, there's very little, because they're moving around so much in that piece, and they're dealing again with these sort of chaotic phenomena. So a lot of what we did was we developed a kind of an oral pedagogy of passing the knowledge of it. And then in that piece, everybody's got an individual click track, which is actually what's controlling the proportional flow. So there's sort of one 12-minute chunk in the middle of a 55-minute sequence that really reads from metered notation. And then everybody's kind of off and running on their flow. And sometimes they get pitch cues and they get like listening cues about how it works across the space. But yeah, so that was like a step past. Then the last couple projects I've done in Berlin this past year really worked with, I really have been eager to and wanting to figure out a way I can meaningfully communicate and structure sonic experience the way I want to. Because I still want to, that's the kind of thing, like I actually, there's something really Beethovenian in me in terms of like my attachment to drama over time and like my wanting to sculpt that. Like, it's not just that I feel like I can offer a text score or let somebody kind of, you know, work through it. That works beautifully for a lot of people. It's just, it doesn't quite get where I tend to want to go. So it's like, how do I shape without sort of both putting this barrier to entry of you have to have, you know, be able to play Bach on marimba or whatever and have made it through, you know, conservatory to get to this point. So how to avoid that as a filter, which obviously intensely constricts the pool of potential collaborators, but maintain some kind of structure that allows me to deal with time in the way that I find satisfying. So for the project in Berlin, which had a ton more movement actually, and a ton more, not just movement across the space, but actually like much more embodied performative gestures. I also worked with click tracks. So it was like a double layer thing of, there was an electroacoustic track which helped sort of cue the atmosphere, and then the click tracks gave movement cues, kind of segment cues, but I was really working, and actually that was a piece they both were using these megaphones I developed for the for a project I did with the New York Philharmonic. And that there also, like, the orchestra was scored, but the 15 musicians who were moving through the space, like the system was, I mean, sorry, I'm rambling a bit, it's just because they're related, like, but the filament came first. So that one I actually like wrote down, when I improvised all the vocal things that I wanted, I transcribed it into the score, and then from that I abstracted sort of textures that were capable of being improvised enough and kind of disseminated live in the space, but they were cued by the three soloists. So it was sort of this power game of passing from the baton of the conductor through the soloist out to the megaphonists who were moving throughout the space. So they knew at Q4, and you know what, I think we had just like one click track, but it was actually just giving pitch guides for the different chords at different moments. They were getting all their temporal information live because of course the conductor was managing the time in that case. So in Hive Rise, the first time we did it in Berlin was in this gigantic water tank, which is like my favorite place on earth. It's completely insane. It has these like, so it's not just one cylinder, it's actually like concentric cylinders with these just super thick brick walls, and it's massive. And even without megaphones, there's like a 15-second reverb for your voice in the space. And it's circular, right? So you, with the megaphones, it's whatever, it's a wonderland. So you can send a sound down this hall and you hear it back here because it whips all the way around the circle and comes back. So anyway, there was no conductor, obviously, there were no live music, other like instrumentalists or anything. And so, but I used that same structure. So there was the electroacoustic track was sort of acting as this reference thing, holding the texture together, holding the time together. And then each section had a kind of textural improvisation that could be deployed live on site, had a lot of room for individual interpretation, but was following a particular trajectory. It had to be like memorizable, as a sequence, so sort of simplified, but quite complex as phenomena as they're emerging in the space. And so the click track there was cueing some of those sections, giving every now and then a kind of pitch guide, but really leaving folks free because there was, I think, 10 performers the first time we did it. Anyway, they all migrate through this labyrinth in different ways, and the audience can kind of follow them, and then they eventually coalesce. But they needed to have a lot of agency. but also like security, that they would know how to find each other at the right moment. So there's some balance there of like wanting to offer them enough, but not too much that it becomes completely dominating of their psyches as they're in the moment with the audience. And then like, we just say the last kind of experiment on that I just did early on in quarantine was this, I don't know if you guys saw this jar thing, but that was the first time I tried to like a video score like that really, there's just, I mean, there's a sort of physical barrier to entry of being able to hold those jars, but other than that, theoretically anybody who can see what I'm doing should be able to perform that piece. So I would say that's the sort of most radically open invitation kind of through a type of notation I've tried so far.
And it allows you to still keep control over some of the drama, right? Like you said, you like to be able to have access to it as a composer and structure it a little bit. So it still gives you some flexibility with how you pace drama, while not restricting you to having to write everything down, pitch by pitch, sound by sound.
Yeah, and again, I think that restriction is both about freeing me toward the sounds and phenomena that I like, but it's also about freeing the participation sort of past that filter of Western trained musicians. So yeah, I'll be interested to see sort of if that continues as a strain in my work. I think it might in some capacity. So
on the topic of, well, I mean, I was going to segue into talking about interior listening protocol, but you hit on it already. But on the topic of these strains in your work, I see that a lot of works that you've written sort of seem to exist in series. I'm thinking you have Library of Lightning and the Echolocator as sort of, the components of Filament, and you have, Albatross and Bound to the Bow seem to exist together. I was wondering if you sort of conceive that in the scheme of your output, and also, when you're making these progressions through works that are tied together, are they related? Is it progress to an end, or do they all sort of exist independently? Just sort of how you conceive that relationship between a lot of the works in your output.
Yeah, sure. It's funny because in the visual arts, the notion of self-repetition is really, really different. Like if you look at Rauschenberg's career or something, there were like 7 years he was doing like this particular type of gold embossed printing or something or like falling down a lot of different rabbit holes and sort of for a period of time really, really working with those materials and trying to mine them and stretch them and see what could be found. And I have, again, as I've been trying to sort of unlearn my own Catholic guilt or whatever from my training, that isn't a model that's, I think, very often. Of course, many of us repeat ourselves all the time, but I think we sort of don't say that we do. Or so I've been trying to unlearn that, because I think a lot of the stuff I've been working with more recently, particularly these like kinetic instrument things, they're really like instruments more than they are material, just. So they feel like acts of invention a bit. And so once I've invented them, I'm kind of attached to them, or whether they're sort of in my repertoire of potential things to use to create new environments or new offerings. So the Albatross was the first time I really, actually that piece has there's a third part of that sort of material evolution. And the first one of it is this electroacoustic ballet I did called Ply. And it was the first project I did at IRCAM that wasn't a course project. So I spent 2 years there. And I did Tripwire, the big installation, my second year. But then I came back to do a big commission. Yeah, it was like with this French choreographer, and I was really excited because I think I had, in my like resistance of the note or whatever, that I sort of previously described in my earlier days, that led me pretty quickly towards morphological structures and these like hyper continuous kind of fluid things, which I was okay with for a while, but I started getting bored with. And so working with the choreographer, it was really great, because it was like, okay, great, how am I going to re-inject that kind of rhythmic vitality without re-injecting my power hand of like, this is beat and like this is polyrhythm and you will do what I say on this part of the quintuplet or whatever. So that was the kind of launch point of the investigation, and it led me to this whole, I really traced a lot of the work and force of things back to that moment. And what Ply uses, it uses this one instrument. I mean, it's a little bit highfalutin to call it an instrument. It was just like a broken down a big rotary fan. So I took my dad helped me like wire cut the frame off of it. I think I was starting to commission like just after, I was moving to France just after January or something. And so I happened to be at home for the holidays, and I came over there. Yeah, so it was just sort of the fins of the propeller, but it still worked. I could plug it in. And then I attached like cut rubber bands, pretty thick rubber bands to each fin. So it would spin, but the things were fleshy, so they were quite soft. And the thing was unstable, and I used this on a million different things. So sometimes I would sort of just put it on its back and it would be spinning, and I would slowly put different objects in its path, and just depending on the distance of the objects to each other, it would change the polyrhythm. So because it was spinning on a fixed speed, so there was a sense of like pulse and pulsation, and then I could like manipulate these accents, right, by just like physically kind of tuning the system. But the thing itself was like, it was like a little imperfect, because like the rubber bands would just like slowly throw it off, or it had like a really like human error quality to it that I really loved, or that would feel really different than, again, like either a polyrhythm programmed on a drum machine or a human percussionist trying to do something that was notated. So yeah, I mean, I did it with objects. I did it like inside the piano, just like depressing different keys, and then sometimes on like a detuned violin laid flat, which just sounds crazy, like a bluegrass player with 5,000 fingers or something. So I don't know, it was really, really fun. It just had like all of that stuff I love, like all of this like vitality and happy accidents, and like just force. It had a lot of agency as a thing. And so that was the material I developed for that project, which didn't have any live aspect. And it was really just me in the studio for hours and hours and weeks performing that and recording it, cutting it up, slicing it all together. And that was the material I used in Albatross. And then, I mean, the reality is a little bit like I got that commission for Bound to the Bow at a moment where I was like, there's no fucking way I have time to do that, And my partner at the time was like, you have to do that. Like, you have to do it. And anyway, so and that person was really like pushing me to reconsider the material, like what could sort of maybe effectively stretch out into that kind of form. So it's part practical. And then that piece was written for a high school orchestra. So I had to also like think about, I think often in these examples I'm giving, I'm sort of using, like, the electroacoustics they're a little bit of a temporal and temporal safety net, where they can like make a thickness that like then the live energy of the players, even if it's not that kind of precision perfect, still adds a ton and still gives them a lot to work with. And so I felt like that material had a lot of potential for an orchestral context. So that's how those got linked together. The filament, like, Library on Lightning thing is similar too. I got that call, and I was like, there's no way in hell I'm going to write a piece for the New York. Like, I can't, they get 20 minutes of rehearsal. Like, I couldn't possibly think of something, that could feel like me under those constraints. And I had a bunch of other deadlines, our brains, not anymore. I've said no to everything. My brain is no longer rented. But at the time, my brain was like rented out for years and years to come. And, but then, yeah, kind of a similar, like, my mentor was just like, you have to do it. Like, what else do you have? And I was like, I have to write this trio for Klang Forum. And she was like, great, make it an orchestra and 3 soloists. And I was like, that's an interesting idea. And then I could, use the trio as a way to test out that material and try to work out the kind of architecture of it. So that's sort of how Landscape on Library on Lightning and Filament got linked.
Who was
Hi was like,
was
you
it?
have to do
Yeah.
it. You can't say no. Yeah, you're probably right. Okay.
Again, you sort of alluded to the path that I wanted to steer this conversation, and sort of take what you said into instrumental technique. And when we spoke with Marcos Balter a couple weeks ago, he was talking about, I have to conceive my music for the person who's going to play it. Like, I can't write it in any other way. But you mentioned, Library on Lightning is for Klang Forum, but Filament was for the New York Phil.
Mm-hmm.
Bound to the Bow is for Interlochen. But when you're conceiving these instrumental techniques, are you working with instrumentalists, or are you, conceiving sounds by yourself? Are you verifying, what you're expecting versus what actually comes of those things? Just how do you develop this, repertoire of techniques that you're using in the instrumental music?
Yeah. Depends on kind of family type. So I think, to be honest, I think I work best and I get farthest if I'm able to just do it myself. And again, kind of bypass that translation gap of me trying to figure out what I want, put it into words, get it into their muscles, come back out to the air, give it feedback. It's just like a slower process. So I usually can do that for string stuff and for percussion stuff. That can be a process of really private improvisation and research that I then try to translate outward. I can't play brass or winds, unfortunately. So in those cases, I very much have leaned on working with specific performers. So I knew for Filament that, it was actually really an embarrassment of riches, because I was like, right, the New York crew was going to be Rebecca Heller and Nate Woolley, and then it was the Klangform crew on the other side. And of course, they, Anders and Nate know each other. They're kind of two trumpet players, and Rebecca and Lorelei know each other. So it was really interesting. I had a New York research kind of crew, and I had a Vienna research crew, and I was going back a little bit, and they were I was able to productively get them into competitive zones and sort of see who could do what. But so in that case, I very much do lean on innovators if I have the luxury of doing that. So for a piece that is that instrumentally focused, the interlocking piece, again, it was high schoolers, so I had a pretty limited repertoire of what I could ask of them, and they did an unbelievable job. I mean, when I tell people that recording is a high school orchestra, they kind of can't believe it. But yeah, I think I was looking for tactics that I felt like I could bring them into, they could have some fun, experimenting with, but that wouldn't require a ton of really specific one-on-one research.
Yeah, on the topic of that recording of interlocking, Alex and I were hanging out with a friend who's a bassoonist, and we were talking about this interview, and he goes, "Oh yeah, I premiered one of her pieces."
Oh, funny.
And I was like, "What did you premiere?" And he was like, "Oh, at interlocking we did this." I'm like, I went back and looked at that recording. I'm like, "No shit, this is a high school orchestra."
Yes.
On
the stage of the New York Philharmonic, which was crazy. It's so adorable. They took a bus from Michigan, an entire bus filled with these, high schoolers, which is I forgot how young that is until I went there for a week to work with them, and I was like, oh my God. Because, I had been teaching college already by then, but there's a difference between a senior in high school and a first-year college student. The bigness of the questions, I feel that they unabashedly ask, and I don't know. It was really fascinating, that comparison. But anyways, then when for the show, we all met up back up in New York, and they just drove 30 hours or whatever to get there, and it was really special.
Yeah, high schoolers ask questions like, "Why did you write this?" And you're like,
yeah. And they're great, and they're great questions, and it's the kind of bigness that the world needs right now. But I feel I don't know, we all get sort of more. Then the questions become sort of how do you make money as a musician or whatever. That's the college age question. Then because they're facing their mountainous debt or whatever. But yeah, it's cute.
Yeah. So back to the force of things. We sort of touched on it, but one of the big questions that we've had collectively is, we've sort of found allusions to why you consider this to be an opera, but we were just sort of wondering if, in your own words, if you could explain why this installation exhibit with an absence of voice and seemingly an absence of narrative is, what you conceive to be an opera.
Yeah, for sure. So to answer that, I'm just going to kind of tell you a little bit the story of the piece, or how its genesis, and I'll get to sort of that word, but I guess it really comes, the exact moment is that I had just come back from Darmstadt, and so I guess it was 2016. It was when Downeyente had premiered Something to Hunt, and I won the Kronensteiner that year, which just meant that I got to plan a big project for the next cycle 2 years later. And Ryan Muncie had premiered Something to Hunt. And right after that, we were both moving to New York. So literally, we both moved from Darmstadt to New York. I was starting a postdoc at Columbia, and he was moving to New York to join ICE. And so we were at this like, you know, seedy East Village bar drinking whiskey like 3 days later, you know, and he had just started with ICE, and he was like, we want to commission something. And I was like, great, I want to make a puppet opera, and I want to bring it to where we can take it to Darmstadt and whatever. I like was kind of just on a big like wanting to connect it to all these different things. And then I talked to my brother, with whom I had collaborated before quite a bit, and recently we had just done a big project together at Schloss Solitude. And he was like, I'll make you some puppets or whatever. So it sort of started there. And then it became, so then the creative conversation then at that point really circles between Adam and me, which is how we get to the phrase opera. So Adam and I had created work before together. I think we were both in our sort of separate fields, and then in looking at the types of multisensory sort of synesthetic integration that we saw happening in the kind of new media field, we were both sort of feeling that that work tended to either feel like really about just a kind of titillation or something, like, which is creepily close to pop-up store, Instagram, like that kind of capitalism, really, or like you're sort of selling the experience. The experiential economy, I guess, is the phrase that's being bantered around about it. So we were really drawn to multisensory saturation and immersion, but we were freaked out a bit by the politics around it. And so I feel like work either tended to be that, or it tended to be demonstrative, like here's a sensor or something happens or whatever, like some kind of didactic approach like that. So we were wanting to see if we could really create a structure that had this multisensory, multi-layered integration, was immersive, but sort of had the pathos and the kind of arc and the kind of evolution that opera has. And we wanted to see if we could sort of render that connection between humans and non-human things, non-human sort of materials. So that, yes, that's Adam and I in that conversation. Then we're sort of circling around. We know we don't want it to have narrative, and we don't. And it sort of took a while for it to really sort of feel like, okay, what is the most crucial, haunting kind of thing for our generation right now? You know, opera was always the place where Western composers went to deal with like the biggest shit. You know, it's just betrayal. It's, I mean, there's also, of course, a light side to opera, but it's like where that part of culture came together to like metabolize and whatever. Even back to the Greeks, it was that sense of that tragedy that was sort of bound in the tragic form, or the play form, or the kind of narrative form of opera. But all of Western opera is, you know, centered around these deeply anthropocentric crises, like melodramatic human crises, right? You all know the storylines and the types of gendered, just messed up everything about that human narrative. So I think the challenge to ourselves was like, can we get that much emotional investment from our audience without relying on human-centered narrative, without relying on story or figure? And then for us, the issue that felt like that most pressing or whatever for ourselves at that moment was just like ecocide, was like the coming wave of collapse, and the wave was already happening then. But it obviously even more so now. And I think it just became, it just crept into the language, and that just started to really be the organizational linkage, conceptual linkage, and material linkage, and the sort of emotional ambitions of the piece started to circle around that. So even though in the beginning it was like kind of clawing a bit through the dark of, we sort of saw it, we kind of had a sense of this evolution, this drama that we wanted, we didn't know really what it was about yet. We knew we didn't want libretto, we knew we didn't want just like, you know, anthropomorphized objects either, sort of having an object opera. But it's really ended up circling around, ecocide and ecological anxiety as and like the inextractability of that, of just like, there's like, how do I stop brutalizing the earth? Like anything I grab, anything I touch, anything I buy gets traced back to this system of violence that is just so, you know, out of my reach. And so I think we were trying to process a lot of that.
Your brother's an architect, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And to me, it sort of seems like that piece and the work you guys do together brings architecture into this group of arts that are working together with music to make like the multimedia direction that one of the directions that, you know, music is taking right now. And I was wondering how architecture played into that installation, and, you know, if it was purely logistical, or if there's some way that the art of architecture and music work together in that work, just how that relationship manifested in that piece.
Yeah, sure. I'm a big believer, I mean, a big believer in collaboration, but a big believer in like DIY. I taught a seminar at Dartmouth called DIY, Don't Do It Yourself. And it was really about creativity and collaboration. And part of that instinct in me is that I want somebody who is obsessive about whatever their material focus is in the project, as I am about sound, who's as neurotically aware, of the cliches and the pitfalls and the histories and the repertoires, so that they can avoid them. Because I think for me, it feels really dangerous to sort of sidestep into or reach out and try to grab from another discipline that I don't know, whose history I don't know. So both in terms of the tactical cliches, like in terms of just like technique or whatever, if I were to try to make a video project and I would use my iMovie or whatever, and like the legibility of those softwares, for example, but also just not knowing the history of video art, not knowing all of the innovations that have happened and all the sort of reinventions of the wheel that I think we see happen a lot actually in multimedia forays in the kind of new music scene is, yeah, I think that's also just, we can't all know everything. Some of us, I think, whatever, hopefully as we age, we know more and more. Some of us know more than others, but I think for me, the desire to collaborate really also comes that I can just obsess here, and I know you're going to obsess there, and I trust each of us to try to just to have that much awareness. So that's why I like to work with folks who have that kind of intense training. And then it's a really interdependent conversation, the way that we work. So we'll sketch together. Mine looks like chicken scratch. His are these perfect, whiteboard drawings. And we did a lot there of material research. So we were looking for things that had structure but had sonic potential, because the infrastructure there is also, it's like an instrument. It's a sound source in the piece as well as a visual source. It just kind of really goes back and forth of me having an idea, him thinking through the spatial implications of it, and having a lot of other ideas on top of that because of, what it might do to the eye in certain proportions or in sort of certain scales. And then we also just had the gift of, he teaches at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and they have this huge warehouse. It's called the Liberty Research Annex, but as architectural faculty, they have access to it. So we had this massive space to work in. So we were able to, in that piece, there's these custom instruments that are just we call them monochords, but they're just big. They're 75-foot double bass strings that made with aircraft cable, basically. So where was I going to get 75 feet to experiment, but I could actually there. We were able to actually physically construct some of the larger components, and I could play them all night when everybody was gone. So I would just sort of do these night sessions there, which is actually, it's a terrifying place to be alone at night because there's weird sounds that come from everywhere. But it was a real luxury in that process. So I think also getting to lean on the architectural resources, we were able to 3D print parts of the structure if we needed to really easily and quickly. So there was a lot of infrastructural help there too. And I will just say maybe the last thing on that, I think the third component that really has helped the marriage, or was crucial to the marriage between my sort of sonic sensibility and his spatial sensibility, was lighting. So it really wasn't until we didn't get a director into the project until quite late, actually, and there's a story to that evolution too, but finally having a director who could help us, and a lighting designer who really could help us understand the way light crafts into the sonic experience. And then lighting is insane. Lighting can make a thing that you think is stable architecture into something radically different. So in that piece, a lot of the soft goods that are hung in those sort of soft walls, they're these sculpted hybrids of crinkled sculpted trace paper, basically, and some pieces of this type of silicone that you pour and cure that we textured in a particular way. And anyways, it's got a lot of topography. So when you side light it, or you front light it, or you backlight it, has an entirely different opacity, density, and that's where we really got. I think in that piece, we were trying to get this sort of affective fluidity we didn't ever want anything to just collapse into that's a glacier, or that's a jellyfish from the future or whatever. But these things, these blobs, depending on how you lit them, they could seem like the hides of some prehistoric beast, or really have a kind of futuristic quality, or they could seem like stilled waves, or they could seem burnt actually if you got them gray. So they had a lot of flexibility. It's really lighting, I think, that has helped us really marry the sort of static architecture, a little bit less static because a lot of it moves instrumentally, but sort of, spatially, it's pretty locked in place with the evolving aspects of the sound.
Carrying that into the topic of multimedia work or relationships between the arts. One of the questions that's yielded us very interesting answers from composers is, what are you reading and what literature influences your works? But in your music, that sort of literary influence seems a little bit background, if at all present, compared to some of the other composers we worked with. But I was just wondering, has there been any sort of literary influence to your work? Is there anything that you're reading right now in this quarantine period that's particularly interesting to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think like every white person on earth right now, I'm reading the new Jim Crow and just finished How to Be an Anti-Racist and whatever. I had already read my White Fragility, so my reading list right now is like very saturated with that. I mean, embarrassing to say that it's now, and whatever. Had been happening sort of over the past years, but of course it's accelerated in a way now that it should have been a long time ago. But so that's literally what I'm taking right now. But I'm also reading Fred Moten, and I'm just taking in a lot of thinkers, like artists that are. And I think one of the things I've been for my classes, but just for myself too, are like when I'm sort of trying to, in this process of trying to figure out like, the molten heart of whiteness and white supremacy and classical music culture and like where it is and how it surfaces everywhere, whatever. It's, one of the, we're in a couple of weeks digging into this artist, Jenny C. Jones, in the sound art class. And she's a sound artist, visual artist, but she deals a lot with something George Lewis has written about a lot too, but this kind of the notion of like the parallel modernisms of particularly the American context in the sort of 50s to 70s, and this fiercely guarded color line and this sort of amnesia that sort of anybody crossed that color line sort of then going through a historical amnesia or like an immediate forgetting, either once they stopped working or once they passed, or so this kind of sense of Cage's allergy to the notion of improvisation as it was happening through bebop and free jazz or whatever he was living through at that exact moment, and his crazy deep disavowal of that, not crazy at all, just like right there. But when I learned about Cage, it's never what we talked about, ever. And to be honest, I don't know that I learned about him until quite late. Like, I don't think I really did as an undergrad. I mean, I must have, but anyway. So I've been also reading Ben Pickett's book on something the avant-garde. I can't remember exactly how it's phrased, but he talks a bit about that. And George has we happen to be just reading it for class on Tuesday, but he has a really fantastic essay on that particular dynamic. So it's a sort of, I think it's called, the subtitle is Aphrological and Neurological Improvisational Styles in the 50s, I think, but it's a sort of direct comparison of Cage and Charlie Parker and sort of how they were dealing with improvisation and aleatoricism or whatever, indeterminacy, and how the world was dealing with them also, and how Cage was dealing with that line. So I think a lot of my reading is about that, but somewhat on that note, I know that last year I had a gloriously luxurious residency where I just got to read a billion things all the time. So in my crazily large Berlin apartment, will be forever grateful. But I would say just a recent obsession, I got really obsessed with Adrienne Piper as an artist, and she's also trained, crazy. I don't know if you guys know that much about her, but she was a protege of Saul Lewitz back in the early days of conceptualism and the conceptual art movement. And then really got wrenched out of that abstraction where she described sort of feeling most artistically drawn and most at home, like into her body as a Black female through the art world around her and the reaction of the world around her. So her work goes through many different phases. Performance art becomes a thing. There are some early sound pieces, but then there's a lot of mixed media pieces in the gallery work later on. But, like the badass that she is, she's still living. She lives in Berlin, actually. Whereas like a lot of the other like systems thinkers and the conceptual art moment and early minimalism were like bantering around, you know, this kind of object rationality and systems thinking, she was like, fuck that, I'm gonna go get a PhD in philosophy. And she did. She was a professor of philosophy. She like, was that Michigan? I can't remember exactly where she landed. She was at Michigan, I think, on the West Coast for a while. But I bring that up just because she's an incredibly clear writer. Like, she writes with this philosophical consistency that is so refreshing when I leave like artists, many artists talking about their work, which just can just be sort of so poetic or evasive or just like floral or something. So she's got 2 huge volumes of essays. Some of it's writing about like individual projects, and some of it's sort of more meta essays on the state of the art world. I just fell pretty hard in love with that work, and it's been really meaningful to me. So that's a more recent one.
And then the last thing I have here is you are someone who's been very able to diversify in terms of space and collaborations between different artistic disciplines. And that's something that we talk about a lot. You know, what can we do with space? What can we do with visual arts and color and whatnot? I was reading an article linked to your website, I think maybe one by Alex Ross, that said you had heard the work of Xenakis and decided, you know, I need to get into, you know, this work with space.
It wasn't I'll tell you the story, but it wasn't hearing. It was like seeing a napkin he scribbled on. Anyway.
That's awesome. Yeah, you know, we've sort of had trouble breaking out of, you know, the concert setting. I mean, we're a young ensemble, so I'm sure time will have some benefit for us. But I was just wondering, you know, what steps are there to take in a system that's very in the box, that we can break into spatialization and, you know, work between disciplines of art? And, you know, what did that journey look like for you into, you know, all of the things that you've done in that regard?
Yeah, so I'm happy to share my story. I don't know that it's not a good recipe necessarily, but I'd like to sort of come back to the brainstorm of like, well, how might it apply to you guys, or how might younger ensembles who are trying to break out of this box to think through that proposition. Yeah, so I had been having these weirder fantasy, sort of multisensory fantasies for quite a while. Adam and I actually did, first time we collaborated was in France when I was 19. We both went to the American Academy in Fontainebleau, France. They like just happened to have a visual arts program, which was architecture, and a sound program, which was composition. And the 4th week of that, they asked the composers and the architects to all team up. And so we made this project that is pretty hilariously connected to conceptually and tactically to a lot of the work we've made since, even though obviously we were just kids. But so anyways, I had been wanting that for a while, and I had been sort of increasingly really frustrated with concert music. The part of that story that involves Xenakis is that some time early on in graduate school, I went down, there was an exhibition at the Drawing Center in New York on his scores. Actually, it was his architectural drawings and his scores. The just really deep similarity actually between the way he would design space and the way he would design his scores. But in the back of that exhibition were a series of projects I had just never learned about. And they were called the polytopes. And they were just these gigantic, insane, like multi-sensory abstract. Some of them were like multi-continental. There was one where he was like trying to beam things like under the ocean. And I didn't have a word for what they were. You know, like they weren't opera. They didn't have a libretto. They weren't a story. They were incredibly intricate, like the one he made for the polytope that was part of the Pompidou opening in Paris. There were like 4 lasers and like a trillion little like mirrors that were turning to try to get the lasers to move around, which I think at the time was like punch card coordination, just like incredible labor to pull these off. Yeah, and so the story is I like got back on the Chinatown bus, which they had back then, up to Harvard, and I like ran into Stephen Takasugi's office and I was like, I'm never writing concert music again. And he was like, no, we need you, or I don't know, can't you do both, he said. And anyways, and then it's funny because so I kind of started this dance a little bit, and that dance was about the logistics of my life too. So for young composers, you know how the game goes, or at least it was in the kind of early 2000s. You get institutional money or support for your work by like applying to competitions and winning a thing, which gets you a commission for an ensemble that you don't get to pick, and that like maybe you get to select the instruments in it, but you certainly don't get to cast the bodies of the performers or ask any questions about how their beings impact their the conveyance of your work, which is just super interesting, because like in theater that would never happen. You would never cast a role without asking how the age, the race, the gender, the accent, the body type of the actor just will impact inevitably the conveyance of the material of the role. Like it's part of the conversation. But of course, it's really not that in music. So anyways, the structures I had access to was like, okay, win this, try to win that, like try to get these. And like, as I just was able to accumulate enough agency, there were 3 times actually that I just had carte blanche. And those were the times when I made the work that sort of feels most like me. And that really is this whatever they're called, this weird multi-sensory time that is like really sound forward, but spatially immersive and quite visually intentional. And those were, so the first time I got to do that, but those 3 opportunities I really mean where I had like institutional money that was in conversation with me, not passing through an ensemble who was then giving me the money, right? Because that's how the sort of financial structure of new music is set up, that like ensembles get money and then they give it to composers to work with them. So the 3 times I had a more direct curatorial agency over the nature of the project was my second year at Earcom. So back then the courses was 2 years long. I got kind of carte blanche to use that production house to make something. And then I made Tripwire there, which was a collaboration with a visual artist. Then Adam and I had a fellowship. We got the Solitude Fellowship at the same time. So I was able to make another one of these big, weird, immersive things. And then again, I kind of told that Darmstadt story. But what it meant to win that prize is that like, Thomas Schaefer was like, great, what do you want to do next year? And it was the first time, a festival director like that was really just asking me, like, what do you want to do? And I could say anything, and he was super supportive. And since we were then able to fundraise over here in the US and ICE was down to that, it was really just, those were the 3 pivotal moments that I've had a chance to do that. And then, Force of Thing, I kind of describe it often that like I had to sort of like elbow out space in the world for Force of Things to exist. Because it's not an easy thing to describe until you see it. Like you've pointed out, it doesn't have a libretto, it doesn't have a sort of obvious storyline. I couldn't really like apply to opera grants. But thankfully I had just started a teaching job, and Adam also had university resources. So we were really able to self-fund a lot of the early parts of the gestation of the project. And then we did like a little snippet of it at this Miller Theater concert of mine. I don't know when that was, 2016 maybe? Maybe I'm getting my dates wrong. So 2014 was that conversation with Ryan. It's like, it felt longer ago than 4 years. But anyway, somehow along the way I had a Miller Theater concert, and I was terrified to do it, but Ross really pushed me to like present a work in progress and really just share something that like completely in process and with the crowd, since it was a little bit of a retrospective, which is maybe silly to say when you're 30, but yeah, so we did a little bit of it there. And there's this incredible curator named Jed Wheeler. He was a long time, I think he actually managed Philip Glass back in the day maybe, or definitely has a sort of relationship to the early Glass ensemble. But at some point, like 10 years ago, Montclair State University had this big chunk of money, and they like lured him out to New Jersey and were like, come out here, build your dream theater, and just make work that nobody else is making. So they'll come to us. So they'll come from Manhattan so we can get them out here. So he just has a mandate to make really weird, really big work. And the story he told me, he wrote me out of the blue really shortly thereafter that Miller Theater concert. And we had a coffee in New York, and he was like, I read the little New Yorker preview of the show, the Portrait concert, and he was like, I had no fucking idea what they were talking about. He was like, they completely failed to describe what that thing was. And so he was like, I have to go see it. Like, what is this thing that can't be described? And he couldn't go yet another thing, but he sent his wife as like kind of recon. Anyway, so then Jed took that little thing and was like, we're going to do it full on. We're going to do it huge. Here's your massive budget. Like, so we just got to really, really, really make it there for the first time. And I think that premiere was in 2017. And then, we got to do it again in 2018. So the reason I say I don't know how to make it into a recipe is because I really did sort of fight through that system and that box until I had enough agency to be able to say, this is what I want to bring to the world, and like be able to really advocate for myself and advocate for the collaborators that I want. And now, I just really tell people up front, like when the New York Phil called, I was like, first of all, like, I was like, wait, you should, you do know who you're asking. And then I also was like, it's going to be weird. Like, I'm going to want to work with a director. I'm going to want to work with a lighting designer. I'm going to want to work with bodies in the space. Like, I warn people up front now, and it's sort of more a part of the negotiation. But I say this with total love because I really want to collaborate with each of you, I'm sure someday, but I'm really in a phase where I'm not working with ensembles right now. And so I'm trying to really like rejigger that negotiation that I described. And so that I am in direct communication with curators about what I want to bring and who I want to bring and what I want to share. And that's been a process I've been undergoing for the last 5 years maybe, but sort of with a bit more force, sort of, again, the more agency I get. And the day I guess would say was another one of those opportunities where I had access to institutional resources and was like, cool, I want to take over a water tank, and then I want to do this crazy thing at Berghain, and really was able to just use that in the way I wanted, which is really a gift. All that said, you know, I think the water tank was a fascinating experiment because it was in a city block. That place is usually closed, actually, to the public. It's under this hill. You almost can't see it. It's like creepily right next to where one of the first concentration camps was in Berlin. So it's obviously like that whole city is just saturated with that history, which is really intense. But anyway, you can kind of walk by. The doors are big, but they're usually always locked. And so when we were in our workshops there rehearsing, just like folks from the neighborhood would just like come and be like, what are you guys doing in there? And so we had a ton of like people from the neighborhood came to the show. We were like Dahlia bought, who's the sound curator at the Day, was expecting 30. We just did a workshop performance at the end of the mini kind of work session. Expecting 30, kind of like cautiously bought wine for 70, and like 280 people came, and somehow tried to get shoved into this water tank, which was a thing in itself. So that came because, again, it's just like it was in an unusual space, and the folks from the neighborhood came. Our cast was like from all over Berlin, like super diverse, but on all types of diversity. And so each person kind of brought in their own crew and their own, we're like publicizing it on their own, you know, social media circles. And it was super fascinating, and it was a really electric gathering, I think. It really just made me want to do a lot more in venues that don't have that cultural baggage. My girlfriend's an architect also. They and I were talking about like, I have so far found, you know, a lot of folks are trying to ask that question, even institutions are trying to ask that question and are open to asking it with, I think, even more urgency now. So yeah, I guess as you're talking to festivals, as you're, you know, thinking about these institutional support mechanisms, just trying to free yourself from the stage and trying to free yourself from the room if you can. And of course, you know, it's a hustle, right? You got to bring all your own gear. You got to like, I mean, we were wrapping cables until 2 a.m. that night. It's crazy. Like they're crazy things to do, but I have found them really meaningful. And I think I encourage you all to sort of feel that too, and like play with that sense of escape, because I think also in all of our new like social distance reality, we need big spaces. We need to be able to sort of be farther apart than we can be, you know, huddled on an orchestra stage if we're a big ensemble. So there's all sorts of reasons to motivate, I think, that kind of opening. But for me, it's been partly about how do I use that institutional access that I have, you know, gained through that box or moving through it, and try to use it to break that institution open wider, and not just for my own purposes, but hopefully for, you know, everybody's anyway.
Ash, this has been amazing.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's really good to see you. Well, thanks, guys.
You're amazing.
Yeah, I look forward to watching all the rest of this series too. It seems like a cool project.
You're awesome. Thank you
so much for your time.
See you later. Cheers.
Take care.
Thanks so much for tuning into this week's episode of Everything But the Kitchen Sink. We hope you enjoyed it.
If you'd like to hear more, you can find all the episodes of our summer series on our YouTube channel and our website, alineaensemble.org.
Also, be sure to check out our social media profiles for more information and previews of upcoming episodes. Our handle is Alinéa Ensemble.
Please feel free to share today's episode with anybody you think might like it, and don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or comments.
Stay tuned for more episodes of Everything But the Kitchen Sink, released every Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time.
And as always, we hope you are all safe and well. See you next time. It's one of those things where, you know, you can do it in the practice room 50 times, and you know, when you're really on it, you can probably do it again and again, and then you do it in a gig and it's like, I missed it, you know, I did not. And that, you know, that tension is so much a part of, I think, why I mean, it's one of the things that I love about music making.